Politeness is usually treated as a virtue, but in status-based environments, it often functions very differently. Not because politeness is weak, but because it creates predictable behavior. And predictability is what status games feed on. In professional settings, meetings, hierarchies, negotiations, the most polite person often becomes the most manageable one. Not respected more, just easier to assign expectations to. This isn't about becoming rude or aggressive. It's about recognizing the moment politeness stops being social intelligence and starts becoming a liability. Because once politeness hardens into a role, the game has already decided how you'll be treated. What explains this is how status games assign roles, quietly and without malice. Here's where the dynamic shifts. Politeness isn't just behavior, it's information. Every social system operates on signals that communicate position, intention, and availability. These signals flow constantly beneath conscious awareness, creating the invisible architecture that determines who defers to whom, who speaks first, who gets interrupted, and whose preferences carry weight in group decisions. In professional environments, politeness functions as one of the most reliable signals in this system. But what it signals isn't virtue or consideration. It signals friction management capacity. When someone consistently responds to pressure with calm accommodation, when they absorb criticism without pushback, when they defer to others' preferences without negotiation, they're broadcasting specific information about their role in the social structure. They're communicating that they can be counted on to reduce tension rather than create it. This creates what appears to be social harmony. Meetings run smoother when someone automatically yields speaking time. Projects advance faster when someone absorbs additional responsibilities without complaint. Conflicts resolve quicker when someone consistently takes the accommodating position. But social systems don't just notice this friction reduction, they begin to depend on it. The polite individual becomes integrated into the group's operational framework, not as a leader or decision maker, but as a stabilizing mechanism. Their predictable accommodation becomes part of how the system maintains equilibrium. This dependency creates a subtle but persistent expectation. The group learns that certain types of pressure can be applied because they know who will absorb it. Difficult conversations can be initiated because they know who will manage the emotional labor. Unpopular decisions can be implemented because they know who will accept them gracefully. Yet here's what makes this dynamic particularly invisible. The polite person often experiences this as being valued and trusted. They're the one people turn to when situations get complicated. They're included in sensitive discussions. They're asked to handle delicate matters. But there's a crucial question that emerges from this pattern, one that most people never examine directly. Is this trust actually authority, or is it something else entirely? That's the first quiet shift most people never notice. This is where trust and authority diverge. The distinction between trust and authority reveals itself through a simple test. Who adjusts their behavior when disagreement arises? Authority doesn't require explanation or justification. It simply states position and expects accommodation from others. Trust, by contrast, often requires the trusted person to do the accommodating. Consider how this plays out in typical workplace dynamics. When the polite team member disagrees with a direction, they're expected to present their concerns diplomatically, provide detailed reasoning, and ultimately find ways to support the decision, even if they remain unconvinced. When less polite team members disagree, the expectation is different. Their resistance is taken more seriously. Their concerns require more substantial address. The group works harder to bring them on board because their cooperation can't be assumed. This difference emerges because authority in social systems doesn't flow from competence or virtue. It flows from friction management, specifically from the ability to create productive friction rather than absorb it. The person who can say no without extensive justification, who can express disagreement without diplomatic cushioning, who can maintain their position without accommodating others' discomfort, this person signals that their cooperation is valuable precisely because it can't be taken for granted. Silence, calm, and politeness all signal the same thing in status games: predictability. And predictability is what roles are built on. The polite individual becomes locked into a specific role within the group's hierarchy, not through formal assignment or explicit agreement, but through the accumulated weight of consistent behavior patterns. Each polite response reinforces the expectation of future politeness. Each accommodation establishes precedent for future accommodation. Each instance of friction absorption creates demand for continued friction absorption. The role becomes self-reinforcing because breaking it feels socially disruptive. When the consistently polite person suddenly becomes less accommodating, it doesn't register as normal variation in behavior. It feels like a violation of social contract. Others experience this shift as the polite person being difficult or acting out of character. Not because they've become unreasonable, but because they've disrupted a pattern that the group had learned to depend upon. This creates a psychological trap. The polite person faces a choice between maintaining their established role or accepting the social friction that comes with changing it. Most choose maintenance because the alternative feels like becoming someone they don't want to be. But this choice isn't really about personality or values. It's about position within a system that has organized itself around their predictability. The system doesn't need them to be polite because politeness is inherently valuable. It needs them to be polite because their politeness serves a specific function in maintaining group stability and operational efficiency. This is the part most people misunderstand. This brings us to a critical distinction that most people never recognize: the difference between chosen politeness and automatic politeness. The distinction isn't about frequency or intensity. Both can appear identical from the outside. The difference lies in the decision-making process that produces the behavior. Chosen politeness emerges from situational assessment. It considers context, evaluates options, and selects politeness as the most effective approach for achieving specific objectives. It can be withdrawn or modified based on changing circumstances. Automatic politeness emerges from role identification. It operates as a default response regardless of context or effectiveness. It continues even when it produces negative outcomes because it has become part of identity rather than strategy. Chosen politeness reads as control. Automatic politeness reads as availability. This distinction becomes visible in how others respond to polite behavior. When politeness appears chosen, it carries weight. Others recognize it as a deliberate decision that could be made differently. They treat it with respect because they understand it represents conscious restraint rather than automatic compliance. When politeness appears automatic, it loses this weight. Others begin to take it for granted because they recognize it as a fixed characteristic rather than a strategic choice. They stop seeing it as something that could be withdrawn. The person operating from chosen politeness maintains what might be called politeness leverage. Their courtesy carries impact because others understand it's conditional. Their accommodation feels generous because it's clearly voluntary. The person operating from automatic politeness loses this leverage. Their courtesy becomes expected rather than appreciated. Their accommodation feels obligatory because it appears involuntary. That distinction determines how you're positioned. But here's where the analysis becomes more complex. The shift from chosen to automatic politeness often happens gradually without conscious awareness. It begins as strategic behavior and slowly transforms into identity-based behavior through repetition and social reinforcement. The polite person doesn't wake up one day and decide to become automatically accommodating. They simply notice that politeness produces positive responses, reduces conflict, and makes social interaction smoother. Over time, this positive feedback loop transforms conscious strategy into unconscious habit. The transformation accelerates when others begin to expect and depend on the polite behavior. What started as a choice becomes a social obligation. What began as flexibility becomes rigidity. Not rigidity in being harsh, but rigidity in being accommodating. This creates a paradox. The person becomes trapped by their own social success. Their politeness works so well at managing relationships and reducing friction that they lose the ability to be selectively impolite when the situation requires it. The cost shows up quietly, not dramatically. The cost of this transformation reveals itself not through dramatic confrontation or obvious exploitation, but through the gradual formation of invisible ceilings. The automatically polite person finds themselves trusted with increasingly complex responsibilities, but excluded from increasingly important decisions. They become the person others turn to for implementation but not for strategy, for execution but not for vision. This exclusion doesn't happen through malice or conscious discrimination. It happens through the simple recognition that decision-making often requires the ability to create productive friction, to push back against popular opinion, to maintain unpopular positions under pressure. The automatically polite person has demonstrated through consistent behavior that they will ultimately accommodate rather than create this type of friction. This makes them valuable for certain functions and unsuitable for others. They become trusted but not deferred to, relied upon but not followed, included but not influential. The system learns their placement and rarely self-corrects because the placement serves the system's needs effectively. Why promote someone to a role that requires friction creation when they've demonstrated mastery at friction absorption? This creates a stable but limiting equilibrium. The polite person remains valuable to the organization, but within carefully defined boundaries. They advance in responsibility but not in authority. They gain trust but not influence. The limitation becomes self-perpetuating because the skills required for their current role, accommodation, flexibility, friction absorption, are different from the skills required for advancement, boundary setting, position maintenance, strategic friction creation. Yet the system provides no incentive for developing these different skills because the current arrangement works well for everyone except the person trapped within it. Status rewards clarity of signal, not virtue. The person who signals consistent accommodation receives consistent accommodation expectations. The person who signals selective cooperation receives more careful consideration of their preferences and positions. This isn't about fairness or justice. It's about information processing and social systems. Groups learn to predict individual behavior and organize themselves around those predictions. Once the predictions become reliable, changing them requires disrupting established patterns, something most people find difficult to do. The recognition of this dynamic doesn't immediately suggest solutions or strategies. It simply illuminates how social systems convert individual virtues into systemic functions, and how those functions can become constraints on the very people who perform them most effectively. Awareness of this doesn't make you harsher, it makes you deliberate. And in environments governed by status, deliberateness is leverage.